That's a horrible notion to me. It's a subversive notion. And if you're somebody who likes to exercise on an empty stomach, Theanine, theanine. Because of the way caffeine works, I should mention that if you ingest caffeine on an empty stomach, it will have a more potent stimulant effect. That will also tend to increase the level of jitteriness that caffeine can produce. Later, I'll talk about ways to offset that jitteriness, but I'll just tell you one tool now. Many people opt to take 100 milligrams of theanine, 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 as a way to offset some of that jitteriness. Theanine will reduce the jitteriness of caffeine, which is why many energy drink manufacturers and even some coffee manufacturers are now putting theanine in energy drinks and in ground coffee because, no surprise, it allows people to consume more of that beverage and thereby purchase more of that beverage, which is what these vendors want, without feeling overly anxious and jittery. So you can take pill form theanine if you want with your caffeine. I don't tend to do that. Rather, I control the total dosage of my caffeine. I do tend to consume caffeine on an empty stomach because I do restrict my caffeine intake to the early part of the day. And I generally eat my first meal somewhere around 11 a.m. And then I generally eat my last meal sometime around 8 p.m. or so. Those are averages, I would say, plus or minus an hour. And that's not because I'm religiously following any kind of time-restricted feeding. It's just though that tends to work best with my schedule and my appetite. But again, that's a general theme. There are days in which I wake up and I'm very hungry and I might ingest something, small snack or something. Or if I'm meeting somebody for breakfast, sometimes I'll have breakfast, sometimes I won't, and so on and so forth. The point is that you can get away with drinking less caffeine to get the stimulant effect if you do it on an empty stomach. And if you're somebody who likes to exercise on an empty stomach, and I'm one of those people, well then ingesting caffeine just prior to exercise can be a fantastic tool. A little bit later, we'll talk about some of the physical performance enhancing effects of caffeine, but I'll just briefly jump to a point about that as we relate to morning exercise. If you are somebody who regularly ingests caffeine, and we can define regularly by if you've ingested caffeine every day for the last 2 weeks, you're a regular consumer of caffeine. Whereas if you're somebody who only ingests caffeine somewhere between 2 and 4 times per week, well, then you are not a regular consumer of caffeine. You're an intermittent user of caffeine. Well, if you're somebody who's a regular user of caffeine, the performance enhancing effects of caffeine are going to be most dramatic if you take 2 or 3 days off from drinking caffeine, which to my mind as I don't want to call myself a caffeine addict, but a regular caffeine user, that's a horrible notion to me. It is a subversive notion because I do like the effects of caffeine so much. But if you really want to see the maximum performance enhancing effects of caffeine, you will do either one of 2 things. You will either abstain from caffeine for a few days or 3 days prior to ingesting caffeine, or you will use caffeine on an empty stomach. It's very clear that caffeine on an empty stomach enhances both the mental and physical enhancing effects of caffeine. And of course, all of that has to be stated on the backdrop of consideration that if you're very, very hungry, it can make it hard to concentrate and so on and so forth. So I'm not encouraging people to starve themselves by any means. Certainly don't do that. But if you want to maximize the performance enhancing effects of caffeine, you will consume it on an empty stomach. And then as a final point to that, caffeine is a diuretic. It causes us to lose fluid and along with that fluid to excrete sodium because of the effects of caffeine on various processes within the kidney. So one thing that works very well to maintain mood and alertness longer given a certain amount of caffeine intake and to avoid the jitteriness and what can sometimes feel like a crash or low blood sugar feeling or even blurry vision is to make sure that you consume at least an equal volume of water with your caffeine. And ideally that water would contain maybe a small pinch of salt or some sort of electrolyte drink or powder rather. For me, I use Element. Full disclosure, they are a podcast affiliate and sponsor, but you don't need to do that. You could simply just have a glass of water alongside your coffee or espresso or your yerba mate and just put a small pinch of sea salt in that or even just plain table salt. And that will help offset some of the jitteriness of caffeine. A lot of people think that when they ingest caffeine, they get the jitteriness and crash because their blood sugar is low. And while that can be the case, oftentimes it's simply because of the excretion of sodium that's occurred when they've ingested caffeine. So I encourage you to hydrate well and to hydrate with something that contains a little bit of sodium, obviously not so much that it increases hypertension or something of that sort, but a small amount of sodium, or an electrolyte drink like Element, and there are other electrolyte drinks out there that can accomplish the same, of course. Just a couple of quick notes about theanine, because there are a growing number of products out there that contain theanine, and there's certainly a growing number of people out there who are using theanine for the effect that I described before, which is to offset some of the jitteriness associated with caffeine-containing beverages or foods.